All right, we are back, the OG team this week again, and hopefully every week. Maybe not next week. We'll see. All right, so obviously in assessment mode, we've been having some episodes where we've been going away from assessments a little bit as we sort of like bring more of our staff into these conversations, but going back to some assessment topics this week. One that I have found interesting, obviously all of us have been on the road a lot doing these assessments with different colleges and different levels, different locations. Like obviously each of them have different staffs that they're bringing on. But one thing I feel that comes up a decent amount is freshmen. We obviously typically can tell a freshman just from how they're interacting and how they're able to sort of adapt to their new environment. But I think some of the trends we see for freshmen as we go into those college assessments, or I think both positives and negatives we're seeing come in there, I think is an interesting thing to kind of talk through. As you know, we like to kind of reflect on the system that the athletes are in generally, and is it working for them? What's working? What's not working? So I'll kick it, and then obviously feedback. But I think one thing we see a lot that I think is interesting, because Laura, obviously lately I've been traveling with you, and some of the questions we ask around the freshmen are, what is their comfort in the weight room and things like that? And I think typically it's actually they have been before. I think there's less people that like they haven't trained and they haven't. And so I think it's more interesting to me that freshmen come in probably more trained than ever before, but fatigued at a level that's typically pretty high. A lot of times shut down already when they come because they have some sort of pain that they came onto campus with that was not known or was surprising to the staff. So I think sort of the thing I have seen with freshman pitchers is that it almost requires a plan of how do we get this pitcher to a healthy base again. If we are planning to use her, which I think I'm going to go ahead and say, unfortunately, and we can read into that as we want, most are planning to use them, which I think is a separate conversation about development and quantity of pitchers out there and things like that. But if we are planning to use them, how do we get them healthy enough and performing at the level we need to fast enough to be ready for February, March? What does that plan look like? Or, oh, shoot, we didn't know this kid was coming in with this. You know, we see a lot of that. So curious what some of your reflections are. And I also think maybe Ashley, Laura, whoever, what some of the like solutions might be, plans of attack that we have to go after with some of these kids, what that looks like for some of these programs.
Up to you.
Either one. Who's up?
Shall I? Okay. Yeah, this is obviously there are exceptions to everything. This is not like every single freshman that we assess fits the following profile. But generally, I mean, it's pretty clear as day. They don't know what the hell they're doing. They have no idea what the hell they're doing. And this is not their fault. And here are the examples of things we see that show us they have no idea what they're doing. They label so many pitches. That it is like wild. 7, 6, 7, 8 pitches. That is like, there's just no way, right? So they have so many pitch names because they follow this traditional world of what pitching variability is. It's like call all the things.
Every freshman has fast, change, drop, rise, curve, screw.
They have every single pitch name that exists, like they do. Because if they don't have it, it feels as if they haven't, like the progressing at the youth level is about gaining the pitch names. Like that's basically, I'm not saying that's what it should be, but that's like, it's like, I only have a drop. So like, basically I'm 12. I'm like, no, you are 17 and you throw hard and your drop is -8. Like we're good, you know, but like they, you know, progressing in the youth world is about gaining the names. And a lot of times, and I'm not talking about OGX world, because obviously we spend a lot of time showing what's real showing the data, educating our athletes, their families, etc. But in the general world, like get out of the OGX bubble, people like stop going to pitching coaches because they say like, I wanted to learn curve and rise and she doesn't know how to teach that, or she won't let me go beyond drop. Like there's a real world where like how good a pitching coach is when they can show you all the pitches. So that's the first ridiculous piece, that we need to like talk about and tackle. So they have all the names and it's like, and then they'll throw 7. And sometimes they're like, I also sometimes throw this. And I'm just like, at this point, if you've got it, you throw it, because this is the opportunity to educate you on what the hell is even happening right now,
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing. They're wildly misinformed. The second thing is that their warm-ups are absurd. I think they are. This is like point number 2. And I love all the freshmen. This is not a personal attack out there.
Mm-hmm.
But their warm-ups are absurd. They snap every pitch. So it's like you have 12 pitch types. None of them do anything different. And you start them all off with a wrist snap. Like, it's just like, what? It's like, because it's so opposite of the world we live in OGX, usually like the first time I see it, I'm like, oh, right. Yeah. Like I have to like shake it off for a second. Like, cause my brain is like, alert. But their warm-ups are insane. They warm up 88 pitches with snaps and T's and K's. They're warming up an arm slot they never have access to, basically, and yeah, and they warm it and they think command is break. Like, they're lost. I don't know how else to explain that. They're just lost. And this is not a personal, like, oh, what, I'm not trying to be like negative and nasty. It's just a real representation of the education at the youth level for the most part, like they're just totally lost. They say, oh, that wasn't a good one. Let me throw it again. I'm like, it looked good to me. Like, I know you didn't command it where you wanted to, but we're not here talking about command right now. We will throughout the year and with consulting and how you're doing with command. We just want to first be able to see what you're able to achieve on the ball. They have no concept of break versus command. To them, a good pitch is just the one that goes to the spot they want. And that makes sense. So I just think across the board, we see too many labels and totally lost in what the pitches are actually doing. And they're like, well, normally that cuts like this. And I'm like, God, no, it doesn't. We don't need to have ever seen you before. First of all, that break profile is not possible. Or like, we're seeing every pitch you throw spin the same way because look at your hand position. It's the same on every pitch. So like, they're little robots regurgitating pitching lesson land. And I hate for this to be a jab at pitching coaches out there because that's not fair and it's hard to overgeneralize. But in the world in which we live in, you gotta put it'd be a hard sell for me to look at any traditional pitching lesson structure in the world out there for me to be like, that's what, that's really going to catapult that kid forward. It could be positive for things like good mentoring relationships, teaching a kid how to compete. But as far as player development concerned, that doesn't exist. That doesn't exist in a bullpen, in a single bullpen once a week in a lesson. So they're just kind of repeating the phrases that they hear. They'll tell you what they're doing. And I'm like, just like real quick, we got sensors on you that like there's going to be objective data, and also I study this shit like for 12 hours a day. So like you don't have like it's not condescending, but it's them being like, let me tell you what someone else told me I'm doing. I'm just like, they're just like kind of like lost little puppies out there. And I'm like, I think to myself, I'm so glad you're here because you're at a school that is valuing information, education, and I'm always like a little extra detailed in those debriefs with the freshmen because in the circumstances where the coaches let them listen to it, I'm like, this is like, I want this to be like, welcome to the first day of the rest of your career. Let's look the truth in the eye. Like, let's just stare it right in the face, and like, you're probably even better than you thought you were. Like, that doesn't mean these kids aren't good. But they just don't know who they are. They don't have an identity because their identity is everything. It's the jack of all trades, the master of none. So it's like, let's start establishing who you are, what you are, and how to go about just really being great at it. So I think it's an exciting, but it also kind of makes me sad for them in the moment. Like, you've been working your ass off and it's a whole lot of darts flying all over the place. A couple other things that I see, their movement quality is usually terrible. And a lot of times it's not a stability, as you're saying. I think generally athletes are understanding this connection between I have to get in the strength floor, but like their single leg stability is usually poor. Landing on a single leg, they don't rotate well. Their lats are atrocious. Like, they basically, like, it doesn't appear to me that it's shocking to me. I think I've had like 2 or 3 where someone's a freshman, and it's very clear that the strength and conditioning they're doing is actually connected to what the strength and conditioning needs to build resilience against the motion. It needs to help. You need to be able to bring good movement quality into the movement. And that's very rare for freshmen. Now, I have had a couple of them where someone's like a junior and a senior and movement quality is poor. And I'm like, this is so rare to see. By the time we're working with schools, they understand what strength and conditioning needs to look like, but it's very common. Like, oh, this is a freshman. That makes sense. So, strength and conditioning, are they doing it? Probably. Is it missing the mark? Yes. That's to be expected. And their velocity is so low. Like people, a lot of times coaches are panicking. They're like, she was throwing 66, 67 when I saw her, when we really wanted her. And like assessments like 61, 62. And I'll look at her where she's at. I'm like, she's probably a tier and a half down of just absolute exhaustion. Let's give her a hot second. So in almost all of those debriefs, I always say, let's wait a month or two and see where her neutral. Let's get her back to baseline velocity. That's kind of what you were referencing. So, I think that's the reality. This is a real testament to what the youth level is. Like we say it all the time, the youth structure is anti-player development. And we are being asked by these schools to come in and deliver a player development data, objectiveness to like what they do, what they don't do. How do you build it? And everything they've done leading up to that is probably the opposite of it. And you see it. So it's amazing because they have this opportunity now to like really take off. But I really don't think people truly understand how anti-player development the current youth setup is. Not just travel ball, certainly travel ball, but also the lesson setup. The lesson setup is really just like what people rely on. And it's just not it. Missing the mark. So yeah, that's what I think I see. And like I said, it sounds like a negative. I think it depends on the lens you have. It's a negative because you're like, what the hell are we doing at the youth world? That's certainly negative. But I think I'm in the I'm putting on the how can we help this kid grow now that she's at the college level? And I see it as a positive. I'm like, she's going to just take off from here now that she's got what she needs, the resources she needs. So depending on the lens, I guess.
I echo the movement quality side 100%. It's so easy to see when, as a freshman, their rotation has declined, whether they had it in the first place, who knows. I see this collision right now. But I said this a couple podcasts ago about man, if I'm a college coach, I need to be really thinking carefully about my relationships with travel ball organizations, with instructors, about how they are supporting those pitchers getting to campus and at least being healthy. I can understand that, I think in best scenarios, your freshmen that are transitioning to your campus and that summer before that freshman year, yes, play, handful of tournaments, compete, great. And what I really like this trend of is that there are programs that are like, all right, freshmen, get on campus early, come to campus early. Adjust, because I think we got to think about just the stress that these kids are under, these freshmen are under. You're about major life changes, right? You're talking about leaving the safety and the comfort of their family homes, right? The transition just to, the expectations of college, let alone softball. It is an incredibly stressful time for them. And so then to have these potentially unrealistic expectations from their coaches when they get on campus, they got to show up on day one and be the best version of themselves. It sets them up for disaster. It sets them up for anxiety and just feeling like I'm not this version of myself. And so, the pitchers that I think have the low training ages, they don't have a lot of experience in the weight room. I'm also I'm glad for them because I know in these programs that they're attached to now that they're going to grow. They're going to grow. Their ceiling is not what it is right now. They have so much potential just simply because strength and conditioning is start to becoming matched to pitching. But where it starts to really, it's such an impact is the exhaustion, the fatigue, right? They have just been basically hammered in travel ball all summer. If they're playing through July, they maybe have a couple of weeks to transition to campus. And when coaches then get them on campus, okay, well, you got to have a drop ball. You got to have this. It's like, hang on a second. One, fatigue. You have no idea if her slot can even handle that. Two, you have no idea even if her slot without fatigue can handle that. So let's pause for a sec. And I truly think freshmen, you need to almost redshirt your freshman in the fall mentality. You're on a development plan. You need to help them understand what are their campus resources, how to establish a relationship with your strength coach, your AT, right? Get settled with your roommate. I mean, there are so many things happening to them that they are unfamiliar with. And so to me, you know, pitching is a constant for them in all of that, right? Being around the game is a constant for them. Make that fun and approachable because everything else around their life is freaking chaos, right? So give them a chance to adjust. Give them, I like what you said, you know, 1 to 2 months. Let's see if velo rebounds. Let's see what their movement quality does once they get in the weight room. And I say this, this is a hill I will die on. The transition out of spring high school softball into the summer season, I mean, has a tough transition. And high school softball is a really difficult version of the game. Mentally, physically, stressors, all of it. See how they do when they get to campus and things are much more under control. All they have on their plate are classes in softball. That's a wild overgeneralization. Give them a chance to just let themselves adjust and then decide what pitches do you think they can grow based on, obviously, we hope our assessment and information and data and, you know, the player development side, and give them a chance to just figure out who the heck they are in all aspects of their life, right? And so what I find myself saying a lot to freshmen is, you know, when I explain the assessment process, they're nervous. They're like, oh my gosh, you're coming in, you're testing me, you're evaluating me, I'm not going to be good. And what I say is, look, this is just a baseline right now. We understand that you're coming out of travel ball. You might be exhausted. You know, we help your coaches to understand that. The coaches that we work with do understand that. I truly feel that. And this is not about fitting you to a box, right? It's about understanding right now how you express the pitching motion. Are there going to be things you don't do well? Absolutely. Are there going to be things you do well? Yes. But we need to see how that, you know, sort of transcends over the next couple of months as you adjust to this new environment. And so it's very clear to me, you know, when freshmen have just been hammered all summer, you know, they have pitched every inning because they want to win that national championship, the PGF championship, the triple, whatever it is. And they show up on campus and they're like, I'm sorry, I have to do what? I have to go to class. I have to move. I have to leave my parents. I have to do this. It's a lot. It's a lot. And I think respecting that and giving them the opportunity and the grace to just like adjust a little bit before you start throwing new pitches and expectations on them, let them figure out who they are so you know who they are. Because right now, like you said, there's no identity. They're just, I keep saying a bad game of telephone, right? They're just parroting what they're hearing sometimes from their instructors, from high school coaches, travel coaches, whatever, who they are. And they don't know that right now, especially as a pitcher. They just don't know that right now, especially if they've never trained with data. They don't know what their pitches actually do.
I was going to say, I think it's an interesting conversation too, and to kind of like wrap up this question, but of when you are on the recruiting trail, I think the hardest coming out of this, you know, there are exceptions to this. Definitely. We've seen some pitchers that really know themselves. I think a lot of those have happened to be people we work with, but who really know themselves and come into their freshman year very clear on who they are, very clear of where they are in that journey, very clear of if they do have fatigue, what it looks like, they know what but that's really the exception. And so I think if I was a college coach and I was thinking about recruiting, some of the things that just like hit me wrong are this concept of really understanding, like, yes, of course, you want an athlete who's hyper competitive, who gets on the freaking mound and is a bulldog and will win at all costs. But if that trickles into, I also will just listen to whatever anyone says to me. And now it has become like, I've been told this is who I am. And I cannot receive any feedback from that because I'm very rigid in my competitiveness, which sometimes at the high school level are the athletes who have success. They become very rigid in who they are and what they are good at and all of those things. I think you have to really ask the right questions as a college coach for athletes like that, because I think where this collision is the worst is when you deliver information, which we know is true, of this is what you do. It doesn't mean we're taking everything away, but like those 6 pitches do one thing. It's good. It's a really good version of it. And we might be able to grow things off of it, or we might be able to make it even better. And you have an off-speed version of it. And that could be very, very successful at the level you're at. But it doesn't, and maybe you keep the labels so that you understand that's a location thing or whatever. But when you say that in an athlete, because of the system they came out of, cannot hear that. They cannot hear that. They will not hear that. That collision is bad. And that's where sometimes the excitement we feel in delivering that story is like, we're about to make your life a hell of a lot easier. Do one thing really good. You're going to be so good at it. Everything's going to go through the roof. You're going to be able to do it in an easier way. You're going to really understand your story. You're going to do all those things. But when it's heard in the flip side, which I think a lot of our system makes, it makes it hard to hear feedback versus athletes we work with that hear feedback all the time. That is the training, is the feedback is the training. And so if you can't receive the feedback, you can't train with us, because then that doesn't even make sense. The training doesn't work. If you can't hear that and learn from it, it's really hard. And I think that traditional understanding of like coachability is an athlete who does what you say, but not if it's feedback, like does what you say of like, throw this pitch and hit this location and compete and do those things. And so when they hear this sort of objective information about themselves or a development plan, it's hard for them and they break down from it. So I think really understanding that, I think would open your eyes more to athletes who might not look like the bucket you want them to do because of this fatigue, but you can see that you actually might be able to have bigger influence on those athletes because of how they come into it. So I think it might change a little bit of how we think about recruiting and the types of personalities we recruit too, which I kind of see from it. It's like the athletes who are scared that it's an eval versus the ones who are like, what do you got? What am I doing? Let me learn, and
we've had a couple
that is important.
Krista, we've had a couple freshmen this year where the college coach says she didn't play for like a team you would expect, which I'm like, I don't even know the team, so don't worry about that with me. Like you can say who she played for. I'm like, I don't know if that's good or that's not good, really. But she didn't come from such a team, and because she lived in the middle of nowhere and they didn't really have access to that, and she really didn't grow up with a pitching coach. And the first thing I think is like, awesome. I know right away. I'm like, okay, that kid actually is like, talk about a canvas. Whatever we see here today is like, if we see anything good, that's amazing. She's such a canvas. She's going to take off. Those athletes are just like so eager to learn. They're not programmed. Like, I don't want to say like brainwashed because I feel like I'm being kind of negative. That's not what I mean, but they're not like programmed to say the things, And so I think that's so interesting because people don't recruit kids like that though. Like I can tell you who those coaches are who are saying that, and these are the best.
Well, they think what I think is interesting is athletes like that get painted as a project, and I think maybe, but the bigger project is going to be the rigid kid who's hurt, who thinks she has 7 things and has 1. That's a way more complicated project because her patterns are probably ingrained. Her brain is ingrained in that. She's less fluid and open to that. And the amount of work you're going to have to do to get that athlete to trust you as you're kind of pulling things away from her to unravel some of the thoughts she had. To me, that those kids are, if I'm a player development coach, that's a way bigger project than someone who comes in a little underdeveloped but very open. We have an athlete like this right now that trains with us who's going through the recruiting process, and some people have passed on her because she didn't perform at the level they thought she would this summer because she was tired coming out of high school. But I think like that kid's not a project. We could see instantly she already throws hard. She's a canvas that when you get her in the right setting, you're going to need a month, and then she's going to be the best pitcher on your staff. Like she's not a project. Like the kid,
and I also think is like a red flag
who's stuck is a project.
I think like when you're talking about people that are stuck, like if there's like I'm a fan of loyalty and allegiance. I believe in that wholeheartedly. But when it crosses the line into like almost like an unhealthy relationship with a pitching instructor, where it's like that my every success is because of that person. When I fail, it's not because of that. And when I fail, I need an extra lesson. Like that, I'm always like scratching my head. Like if I had a bad week, I have to race for another lesson because that person's incapable of attaching to my failures. You know what I mean? But when I do well, it's because of them. And like, they tell me this, like when it crosses into the, like who I am and what I do is on their back and on their shoulders. I'm like, that's
a project. That's a project. And I think for us, like we don't have that relationship with any of our athletes. Like I think of some of the hitters that they'll come back in the summer and train with us. They'll train with us during winter break. And if I have a conversation with them during the year, it's like, hey, can I call you tonight? Like I'm struggling with XYZ. Can I show you some video? Here's what I'm thinking. Like we might have a brainstorming session with them, or they're like, I just need to vent for a second. Like I'm struggling with XYZ or whatever. But they're not like, he's teaching me all the wrong things. Can you help me solve this. Like, I don't have that relationship with any of our athletes. Like, I just think like, what do you want me to do about it? You're there now. So you have to know enough. You know, these are more of the conversations we would have is like, is that cue helpful to you? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, you're not a freaking robot. So like, what is the respectable version of that exchange?
Yeah.
It
Or
certainly
when that
isn't
coach
to
says
tell
it,
that
what do you
person to
think
call
they
me.
mean?
Right.
Yeah, what do you think
Yeah.
they're trying to say? Like, how can you interpret that? You're too educated at this point. Usually we're annoyed
Right.
at the athletes at that point. We're like,
Totally.
don't give
Just
me
like,
that
what
shit.
do you want me to do?
You are
Yeah,
too
I'm not calling
educated at
that
this
person. You're
point.
21-year-old woman. What
Right.
do you want me to do
Yeah,
about
I'm
it?
like, you're educated. You know what they're trying. What do you think they mean? So that's
But
on
it's a
you
real-
for being like, yeah.
I keep saying the word collision because I see it. It's a real collision though of, you know, when the you know, the pitching coach, whoever it is that is taking them on in the college level is also very rigid in what they think, believe, what they teach, what they whatever. And they have recruits, whether the recruits that they have identified, it's not typically the scenario, but recruits maybe they have not identified that they're inheriting, and that those pitchers have come up through a development system. Woo! You want to talk about a mismatch? That's a wicked mismatch. And like, that's where you end up with unhappy kids in the bullpen. That's where you end up with, you know, lack of buy-in. Like when you talk about like the recruiting side of things, woof, it's a huge collision that I'm seeing right now. And I think like, let's take some credit for that as we've been pushing this, knowing yourself, knowing who you are, leveraging who the hell you are, you know, and whether that pitching coach at that college is like, still learning, really ingrained. It's like you can't have two people who are so ingrained and stuck in what they do. Both sides have to be open and flexible, right? And so you're exploring it together. And I think that is such a unique relationship. And as you talk about like some of the, you know, the best coaches in the country in player development, that's what they're doing. They're not saying this is my style, this is how I do things, you have to do it this way. Everybody has to have these 5 pitches and everyone's got to look like this. And the athlete's not saying, here's who I am, you cannot change this. The beauty of both sides being flexible is this trial and error, this experimentation, this, you know, let's grow together. Let's figure out who you are together. That is such a unique relationship. And boy, I'd be real thoughtful about that if I'm a college coach on the recruiting trail. I'd be real thoughtful.
Well,
and
here's our core. You and I talked about this. Like, here's our core pillars. Here's our bullpen's core pillars. We believe in this. We believe this helps. Here's the proof this helps. Here's why we do this things. But also you come in and you're like, okay, well, here are my core pillars. You know, they're these things. And I feel like this helps me. And we have conversations around those things. But if it's like, it is exactly as I am and that is it, and I will not budge, you know, I think we've seen this a lot, and I think it happens with new staffs, as it should. I think there's a learning period.
Right.
New coaching staffs and freshmen, which is like, we'll be waiting for them to warm up, and it's like, what is happening? Like, there's 18 different things happening, and I'll say like, you know, eventually you have to get to what are the pillars of things that you believe in this bullpen will work, and what are those, and you have conversations around those. But that's the difference, I think, of how we approach it. Of course, there are ways we do things, you know, and things that we believe are effective, and you know, all of our pitchers throw plyos, and we swing overload bats, and we do a particular set of drills that we think are efficient. But at the end of the day, what our athletes are learning is the core principles as pitchers of, what does my body do? What slot do I get into? What pitches do I have access into? How might I influence that if I wanted to? How does my body break down when I'm fatigued?
Yeah.
Right. How does my body break down when I'm fatigued? Hitters, the same thing. What is the ball telling me? If the ball goes that direction, what do I know that means about my own swing? And so when they get in an environment that hopefully, you know, as all of our partners, I think, is open to player development, but might do it differently, or might have a different set of drills, they don't panic. Because it's like, okay, well, this is what I know. And unless that drill or whatever is going directly contrary to sort of like what I know, and then I have to have a conversation, I'm not freaked out by it. It's like, okay, this could help X, Y, Z. And I think, to me, that's just like, that's a much easier journey than these other journeys. And I think we see that a lot. Is like, these kids come in and they're not the version that you recruited, because they're fatigued and they're all these things.
That's right.
But they're not willing to come to you because they have, and you were okay with that because you were like, yeah, but look at her. who cares, you know? And you were like, oh, look at how she's performing. Except what happens when she's not performing like that, which is most of what you're managing as a coach. And what happens?
But then you have to manage her
even better than that.
Right. Yes. Then you have to manage her. Like that's tough.
And I think
I had a coach say to me the other day, and this was not a freshman, but say the tough thing, and this is exactly what you were describing. The tough thing about this athlete, she's very good. She's got really good stuff. The tough thing about this athlete is that she doesn't want to do it the way we do it. She's adamant about the way she's done it, why she's good. You can't change that. So we let her go. And then when she's struggling, it's like, well, you're not doing enough for me. You don't help me. Mm-hmm. Like I feel like kind of like pinned up against the wall with this athlete. Like she's right. She does need help when she is struggling, but it's the same information she didn't want originally. So it's very hard to navigate that athlete. So that's what you're talking about with like a project, the management of athletes like that. It's like everyone's on like, you know, thin ice the whole time, just like, you know, and that's not a great spot to be. I would say overall though, like as player development, like as we're talking about like our assessments growing, the visibility of them growing, the information growing, like I feel like it's what's becoming really good. Are there coaches out there that don't do player development and have a style and only recruit athletes who look like XYZ and they win? Absolutely. And so are there athletes that fit that mold? Absolutely. You know? And so I think of like, what I just think is really important is kind of going back to what you said, Laura, is to know what you need, who you are, what kind of kid you are. If you are going to play for like a player development kind of coach and you're in this, like, I only do things one way, you're probably marrying the wrong person.
That's right.
And so then, you know, and vice versa.
Not going to solve a lot of problems together.
Yeah. Nope. The visibility. The visibility of just like knowing who are people. And it is okay to say like, this is a great program and I'm just not like a match for their culture. Or, you know, for coaches to say the same thing. But I do think you're right. When those things aren't blending, I think, Laura, you said it perfectly of like, you've both got to come into it with that, or not. This is my style. I'll follow that style. End of story. Right. And that's it. And we're not probably heading there for assessments, which is also cool. You know, like, you know, that's just the way they do things differently, whatever. But, yeah, that piece is really important. But I just think that athletes who do come in with that mindset, if they're not coming from like a world like us, or that we have like people that we're connected to at the youth level and little like, you know, they're not like part of OGX, but they're OGX followers and they're doing their best to hold their own in their own world. And they're coming from environments and platforms like that. That's a player development platform for sure. But otherwise, in order for athletes, freshmen, to come in with like, I'm a player development, they had to go against their environment leading up to that.
Because everyone else is like, she didn't want it enough. She didn't try hard enough. She didn't add the pitches she needed to. That's the environment you come from. So
totally.
What's very strange is that you're actually roboted and coached to death, but it's all about wanting it more and harder and more. And don't face the bad stuff really, because you don't need to, because just want it more. And if you want it more, and so then we're like, this kid, she's such a competitor. Except those same kids become very rigid because they've never actually faced what it means to go through a player development. They've never actually faced failure. It's not that they've never had failure, but the way that they were told to deal with failure is just to like want it more, to work harder, to do those things. And so they never faced feedback. They never did those things. And so then they get there and that's terrifying to like have to go look where you aren't good in the eye and make it better instead of just like overcome it by wanting it more. You know, that's a really hard thing. And so I think it's this very weird collision because it's like, it's not that these kids became rigid by not being coached. They got over coached, but in a very particular way. And they just listened to it because that's what they were supposed to do. And so then when they get out of the other side of it, if the coaching is not just like, let me show you how to want it more. Let me give you that and we'll overcome it together. If it's just like, yeah, but I can want it all I want. And if I throw 62 -3 that I ain't going to do it. And they're like, okay, well, let's look at that together and figure out how we can address it. They're like, what? I don't want to do that. That's not how we do this. You know, like trying to look at my weaknesses is not how we do it. And so I think and it's the same for pitching coaches. I'm a hell of a pitching coach if I never have to look that in the eye. And I'm like, see, she's better. Like, look at us. We're just, she's better and we're better. And I added this pitch. You're like, how do you know you have that pitch? No, it went up. It went up. And so now together we've never actually faced the reality of the situation. And that is hard. So I think, that's just something that, we keep growing, and it's the exciting part about how many programs we're working with and the game evolving. And I think the more you take ownership over that and create this ability to kind of look feedback in the eye and just take it as part of like, this is what's going to make me better, the better the pitchers will become.